The winter of 1898 arrived in Leadville, Colorado, with the kind of cold that made men question their faith. It was not merely the temperature that dropped below zero, but something else. Something that seemed to seep from the mountains themselves, as if the earth had grown tired of holding warmth within its ancient bones. The silver mines that had once made fortunes now sat partially abandoned, their shafts like open wounds in the mountainside, exhaling vapors that smelled of sulfur and forgotten ambition. The town had seen better days, better decades, and the people who remained were those who had nowhere else to go, or who had been claimed by the altitude and the solitude in ways that made departure impossible. Leadville sat at an elevation of 10,000 feet, higher than almost any other settlement in North America, a town built in defiance of geography and common sense. The air was thin enough to make newcomers gasp and veterans wheeze. The winters were brutal, starting in October and lasting through May, with snowdrifts that could bury a man and temperatures that could kill in minutes. But in the 1870s and 80s, when silver was discovered in the surrounding mountains, men had come by the thousands, drawn by the promise of wealth, willing to endure any hardship for the chance to strike it rich. Those boom days were over now. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act had been repealed 5 years earlier, and the price of silver had collapsed. The mines were still producing, but at reduced capacity, and many had closed entirely, their owners abandoning them to the mountain that had reluctantly yielded their treasure. The population that had once swelled to 30,000 had dwindled to less than half that. The grand hotels stood partially empty. The opera house that had once hosted touring companies from New York now showed second-rate variety acts to sparse audiences. The streets that had once been crowded with miners and merchants and prostitutes and preachers now hosted a more somber population, people who moved through the cold with the resigned shuffle of those who had accepted diminished expectations. The architecture of Leadville told the story of its rise and decline. There were brick buildings built during the boom, solid structures that spoke of optimism and permanence, decorated with ornate cornices and large windows designed to display merchandise to prosperous customers. But there were also the earlier structures, hastily constructed wooden buildings that had never been meant to last, now leaning and weathered, their paint long since scoured away by wind and snow. And there were the newest buildings, cheap constructions thrown up in the vain hope of a revival that had not come, already looking shabby despite their youth. Walking through Leadville was like reading a chronology of disappointment, each era of construction representing a different stage of hope and subsequent disillusionment. It was in this season of despair that the Hargrove House became available for rent. The building stood on the eastern edge of town, a two-story structure of weathered wood and stone that had witnessed the rise and fall of Leadville's silver boom. It had belonged to a prospector named Josiah Hargrove, a man who had struck it moderately rich in 1879 and built the house as a monument to his success. But Josiah had died 5 years prior, found frozen in his bedroom despite the fire burning in the hearth below, and the house had remained empty ever since. The townspeople whispered about it in the way that people whisper about places where death has visited without invitation. But no one spoke of anything specific, nothing concrete, only the vague unease that settles over a community when it collectively decides that certain places should remain undisturbed. Thomas Brennan arrived in Leadville on the 20th of November, 3 weeks before the incident that would be recorded in the county records as an unexplained death, but would live on in the memories of those who knew the truth. Thomas was a photographer from Boston, 34 years old, with the thin frame and thoughtful eyes of a man who had spent too much time observing life through a lens, rather than participating in it directly. He had come west not for fortune or health, but for work. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad had commissioned him to document the mining towns of the Rockies, to capture what remained of the frontier before it disappeared entirely into the machinery of the new century that loomed just 2 years away. His journey to this point had been circuitous. He had studied chemistry at Harvard, intending to follow his father into the pharmaceutical business, but had discovered photography during his final year and had become obsessed with the medium. There was something about the process that appealed to his methodical mind, the precise measurements of chemicals, the careful calculation of exposure time, the transformation of invisible light into visible image. But more than the technical aspects, he was drawn to the philosophical implications of photography. The camera, he believed, was a tool for capturing truth, for creating permanent records of transient moments, for preserving evidence of existence against the inevitable erosion of memory and time. He had apprenticed with a portrait photographer in Boston, learning the craft, and then had struck out on his own, specializing in documentary work. He photographed the factories and tenements of the industrial Northeast, the immigrant families crowding into cities, the transformation of America from an agricultural nation to an industrial power. His work had a particular quality that clients appreciated, a combination of technical precision and emotional depth. His photographs were clear and well composed, but they also managed to capture something essential about their subjects, some quality of personality or circumstance that made them more than mere documentation. The Railroad Commission was his largest project to date, and he had approached it with the seriousness he brought to all his work. He had spent 6 months already traveling through Wyoming and Colorado, photographing mining operations, railroad construction, the small towns that had sprung up along the routes. He worked alone, preferring solitude to companionship, carrying his equipment from place to place, setting up his portable darkroom in hotel rooms and boarding houses, developing his plates with the care of a craftsman who took pride in his work. But there was something else, driving him beyond professional ambition. Thomas was haunted by the awareness of mortality, by the knowledge that everything he photographed was already in the process of disappearing. The frontier towns he documented were dying. The ways of life he captured were ending. The people he photographed would soon be gone, leaving only his images as evidence they had existed at all. Photography was his way of fighting against death, against forgetting, against the terrible impermanence of human existence. Each photograph was a small victory against time, a preserved moment that death could not erase. He did not yet understand that some things should be allowed to die, that some moments should not be preserved, that death sometimes serves a purpose that preservation violates. He would learn this lesson in the Hargrove House, in front of a window that showed what should have remained hidden, but by then it would be too late. The very qualities that made him an excellent photographer, his attention to detail, his persistence, his inability to look away, would become the tools of his destruction. He carried with him 3 cameras, several dozen glass plates, chemicals for developing, and a leather journal in which he recorded not just technical notes about exposure and composition, but also his impressions of the places he visited and the people he encountered. Thomas was a man who believed that photography was not merely about capturing light, but about preserving memory, about creating evidence that certain moments, certain places, certain souls had existed. He did not yet understand that some things should not be preserved, that some memories are meant to fade, and that certain evidence is better left unrecorded. The landlord who showed him the Hargrove House was a man named Dutch Morrison, a former mine supervisor with hands scarred by rope burns and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite that filled the mountains. Dutch was reluctant to rent the place. Thomas could see that immediately, but the winter had been hard and money was scarce, and the house was just sitting there, accumulating dust and the kind of reputation that made it worthless unless someone from outside, someone who did not know the stories, could be convinced to take it. The rent was absurdly low, a detail that should have given Thomas pause, but instead appealed to his practical nature. He had a limited budget for his time in Colorado, and the cheaper the accommodation, the longer he could stay, and the more work he could complete. Dutch walked him through the rooms with the perfunctory manner of a man fulfilling an obligation he did not believe in. The house was furnished after a fashion, with pieces that Josiah Hargrove had accumulated during his prosperous years. Heavy oak furniture, a grandfather clock that no longer kept time, oil paintings of mountain landscapes that seemed darker than the subjects warranted, and curtains that had once been red, but had faded to the color of dried blood. The window was on the second floor, in what had been Josiah's bedroom. It faced west, toward the mountains, and it was larger than necessary, nearly 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, with an ornate wooden frame that someone had carved with intricate patterns of vines and leaves. The craftsmanship was remarkable, the kind of detailed work that spoke of patience and skill, and perhaps obsession. The vines twisted around the frame in elaborate spirals, and hidden among the leaves were other shapes, harder to discern, faces perhaps, or skulls, or symbols whose meaning had been forgotten or deliberately obscured. The wood itself was dark, darker than walnut, with a grain that seemed to move and shift when looked at from different angles, as if it had been cut from a tree that had grown in shadow, that had never known full sunlight. The glass was old, the kind with slight imperfections that made the view through it shimmer and distort in ways that modern glass did not. There were bubbles trapped within it, microscopic spheres of air frozen in the silicate matrix, and there were waves, subtle undulations in the surface that created ripples in the light passing through. When Thomas looked through the window at the mountains beyond, they seemed to waver slightly, to pulse with an almost organic rhythm, as if the glass itself were breathing, as if it were not quite solid, not quite fixed in its state. The panes were large, larger than was common for the period, and they were held in place by lead cane that had oxidized to a dull gray-green. There were 12 panes in total, arranged in a grid of 3 by 4, and each pane seemed to have its own character, its own particular quality of distortion. Some were clearer than others. Some seemed to hold shadows that did not correspond to any object in the room. One pane, in the lower left corner, had what appeared to be a flaw in the glass, a dark spot like a pupil that seemed to follow Thomas when he moved, though he knew this was an optical illusion, a trick of the light and his tired mind. Thomas stood before it and looked out at the snow-covered peaks, catching the last light of the afternoon, and he thought it was perhaps the finest window he had ever seen, the kind of window that a photographer might appreciate for the way it framed the world beyond. But there was something else about it too, something he could not quite articulate, a feeling that the window was not just a passive portal, but something more active, something that did not merely allow viewing, but compelled it, demanded it, insisted upon attention in a way that ordinary windows did not. The room around the window was cold, colder than the rest of the house, cold in a way that seemed to emanate from the window itself, rather than from outside. The walls near the window were discolored, stained with something that might have been water damage, but looked more like frost, like permanent ice that had seeped into the wood and plaster and could not be removed. The floor in front of the window was worn, the boards smoothed as if by years of someone standing in that exact spot, wearing away the grain with patient persistence, night after night, year after year, staring out at the mountains or perhaps at something else, something that only appeared under certain conditions, at certain times, in certain states of perception. Dutch stood behind him, silent, and when Thomas turned around, he saw something in the older man's face, a tightness around the eyes, a tension in the jaw, but Dutch said nothing about the window specifically, only mentioned that the bedroom was cold, colder than the other rooms, and that Thomas might want to sleep in one of the smaller chambers on the first floor. Thomas thanked him for the suggestion, but said he preferred rooms with good light, and the western window would give him the mountain sunsets that he wanted to photograph. Dutch nodded slowly, as if Thomas had just confirmed something he had suspected, and then he handed over the keys and left without the usual pleasantries that conclude such transactions. Thomas spent the first 3 days settling in and exploring Leadville with his cameras. He photographed the abandoned mine entrances, the rows of identical company houses where miners' families still lived in varying degrees of poverty, the saloons that seemed to outnumber the churches, and the faces of men who looked simultaneously young and ancient, aged prematurely by altitude and labor and disappointment. He developed his plates in the kitchen, which he had converted into a makeshift darkroom, hanging blankets over the windows and setting up his trays of chemicals on the counter. The work was familiar and comforting, the ritual of watching images emerge from blank glass like ghosts gaining substance, and for those first days he forgot about the peculiar coldness of the bedroom upstairs, forgot about Dutch's unspoken warning, forgot about everything except the craft that had given his life purpose. He slept well those first nights, exhausted by the altitude and the work, falling into bed in one of the first-floor rooms without even bothering to fully undress. But on the fourth night, the 23rd of November, Thomas decided to move his belongings upstairs to the master bedroom. He told himself it was a practical decision, that the room was larger and would give him space to organize his equipment. But there was something else too, something he could not quite articulate, a curiosity about the window and the light it would offer, and perhaps a photographer's instinct that there was something worth seeing from that particular vantage point. He carried his few possessions up the narrow staircase as the sun was setting, filling the room with that particular quality of light that exists only in the mountains in winter, a light that seems to come from the snow itself rather than the sky. The room was cold. Dutch had been right about that. Cold in a way that the small iron stove in the corner could not seem to remedy, no matter how much wood Thomas fed into it. He made up the bed with the linens he had brought from Boston, hung his few clothes in the wardrobe, and arranged his current camera and journal on the small table beside the window. Night came quickly at that altitude, the sun dropping behind the peaks and taking all warmth with it. Thomas ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, read for a while by lamplight, and then prepared for bed. It was nearly 11 o'clock when he finally extinguished the lamp and settled under the heavy quilts, his breath visible in the air despite the stove's efforts. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the wind outside, a constant presence in the mountains, a sound like the earth breathing, and he thought about the photographs he would take tomorrow, about the strange beauty of decay that he was documenting, about the way places could hold the memory of their purpose even after that purpose had been abandoned. He did not intend to stay awake until midnight. He had no reason to believe that midnight held any significance. But sleep did not come easily in the thin air and the unfamiliar cold, and so he lay there, hovering in that space between waking and dreaming, aware of the room around him, aware of the window across from the bed, aware of the quality of darkness that seemed different here than in other places, thicker somehow, more substantial. When the grandfather clock downstairs began to chime midnight, Thomas was still awake. He counted the deep, resonant tones, 12 of them, echoing through the empty house. The sound was different at night, deeper somehow, as if the darkness added weight to the vibrations, as if the air itself had thickened with the absence of light. Each chime seemed to hang in the air longer than it should, overlapping with the next, creating a discordant harmony that made Thomas's teeth ache. And in the silence that followed the final chime, in that particular quality of quiet that exists only in the moment after sound has ceased, he saw the light in the window. It was not the moonlight, though the moon was nearly full that night, hanging low over the mountains like a blind white eye. It was not the reflection of his stove, which had burned down to embers that pulsed with a dull orange glow in the corner of his vision. It was a different kind of light, a pale greenish luminescence that seemed to emanate from the glass itself, as if the window had become a source rather than a portal, as if something on the other side were generating illumination that bled through into his world. The light reminded Thomas of something, and it took him a moment to place the association. It was like the glow of phosphorescent organisms he had once photographed in a marine laboratory in Boston. Tiny creatures that produced their own cold light in the darkness of the ocean depths. Bioluminescence, the scientists had called it, the light of living things. But this light had a quality that suggested the opposite, a luminescence that spoke not of life, but of its absence, a glow that belonged to things that had stopped living, but had not yet fully embraced death, that existed in some liminal space between states. Thomas sat up in bed, his heart beginning to accelerate, his photographer's eye trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The light grew stronger, brighter, spreading across the glass like a liquid, like something flowing from the center of the window, outward toward the frame. And then, as if developing on a photographic plate, as if emerging from the chemical bath of revelation, an image began to appear in the window. It was a face, a human face, but not the face of anyone living. Thomas knew death. He had photographed the dead as part of his work, that peculiar Victorian custom of post-mortem photography, creating a final image of the deceased for their families to preserve. He had learned the techniques from an older photographer in Boston, had been taught how to pose the bodies, how to prop open the eyelids, how to use long exposures to blur any slight movements and create the illusion of peaceful repose. He had photographed dead children arranged with their toys, dead mothers surrounded by their living children, dead patriarchs seated in their favorite chairs. He had become familiar with the particular quality of dead flesh, the way skin took on a waxy appearance within hours of death, the way it became both more fragile and more rigid simultaneously, the way color drained from it like water from a squeezed sponge, leaving behind only pallor and shadow. He knew the way eyes, even when arranged to appear open, had no depth, no light behind them, how the iris became flat, how the pupil failed to respond to illumination, how the whole eye took on the quality of painted glass, a mere surface with nothing behind it. He knew the way mouths, even when closed, had a different shape in death, the muscles no longer maintaining the slight tension of life, the lips becoming thinner, the jaw settling into positions that living jaws never quite achieved. And the face in the window had all these qualities, magnified and impossible to misinterpret. It was a woman, middle-aged, with dark hair pulled back from her face. Her skin had the grey-white pallor of death, and her eyes, though open, were filmed over, seeing nothing. Her mouth was slightly open, as if she had died mid-sentence, mid-breath, mid-thought. She appeared to be pressed against the glass from the outside, her features slightly flattened, her hair spreading around her face like seaweed in water. But this was impossible. Thomas was on the second floor. There was nothing beyond that window except a 20-foot drop to the frozen ground below. He sat frozen in his bed, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything except stare at the apparition in the window. The woman's face remained there, clear and distinct in that strange greenish light, for perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps a minute, time becoming elastic and unreliable. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it faded, the light dimming, the features dissolving back into ordinary darkness until there was nothing but the window again, reflecting the faint glow of the stove's embers. Thomas finally moved. He threw off the blankets and crossed the room in 3 strides, pressing his own face against the glass, looking out into the night. There was nothing there, no ladder, no platform, no explanation. Just the side of the house, dropping away to the ground below, the snow unmarked, the night empty. He checked the latch on the window. It was secure, locked from the inside, and when he examined the frame in the dim light, he could see no evidence that it had been opened recently. Dust lay undisturbed in the corners. He spent the rest of that night sitting in a chair, wrapped in a quilt, staring at the window. He told himself he had been dreaming, that the altitude and the unfamiliar surroundings had produced a waking hallucination, that there was a rational explanation. But he knew, in the way that people know truths that cannot be articulated, that what he had seen was real, or at least real enough to be seen, which in practical terms amounted to the same thing. When dawn finally came, grey and cold, Thomas went downstairs and made coffee with hands that shook slightly. He sat at the kitchen table with his journal and tried to write down what he had experienced, but the words seemed inadequate, unable to capture the visceral horror of seeing that dead face materialize in the glass. He was a man of science, of chemistry and optics, and yet he could find no scientific framework to contain what had occurred. He spent that day in a state of distracted anxiety, going through the motions of his work, but unable to focus. He set up his camera to photograph an abandoned smelting works on the edge of town, but he could not concentrate on composition or exposure. His mind kept returning to the window, to that face, to the question of whether it would happen again. Part of him wanted to pack his equipment and leave immediately, to find accommodation elsewhere, to forget about the Hargrove House and its peculiar window. But another part of him, the part that had made him a photographer, the part that sought to document and understand, wanted to stay, wanted to see if the phenomenon would repeat, wanted evidence. That evening, as darkness fell, Thomas made a decision. He would stay awake through midnight again, and this time he would be prepared. He set up one of his cameras on the tripod, positioned it to face the window directly, loaded a fresh plate, and prepared the flash powder that would allow him to capture an image in the darkness. If the face appeared again, he would photograph it. He would create evidence. He would transform the subjective experience of witnessing into the objective reality of a documented image. He waited in the chair beside his camera, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the window as the clock downstairs ticked away the minutes toward midnight. His rational mind told him that nothing would happen, that the previous night had been an aberration, a trick of exhausted perception. But his instinct, the deeper knowledge that exists below thought, told him to prepare. Midnight came. The clock chimed. And in the silence, after the 12th tone, the light appeared again in the window. This time the face was different. It was a man, younger than the woman had been, perhaps in his 30s, with a thick beard and the weathered skin of someone who had worked outdoors. His face bore the same death marks as the woman's had, the grey pallor, the filmed eyes, the slackness of muscle that no longer responded to will or animation. But there was something else too, something that Thomas had not noticed the previous night in his shock. There was damage. The left side of the man's face was crushed, the cheekbone collapsed inward, the eye socket distorted, as if he had been struck with tremendous force or had fallen from a great height. Thomas forced himself to move. He reached for the camera, his hands trembling but functional, and he removed the lens cap. He lifted the flashpan, ready to ignite it, ready to capture this impossible thing. But as he moved, as his intentions became action, the face in the window changed. The eyes, which had been unseeing, seemed to focus, seemed to look at him, and the mouth, which had been slack, opened wider as if trying to speak or scream or warn. Thomas triggered the flash. The powder ignited with a bright explosion of light that filled the room, temporarily blinding him. When his vision cleared, the window was dark again, empty, showing nothing but his own reflection in the glass. He had the image. It was captured on the plate in his camera, but his hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely operate the equipment to secure the plate and prepare another. He did not sleep that night either. He sat in the chair until dawn, staring at the window, but nothing else appeared. When the sun rose, he carried the exposed plate downstairs to his makeshift darkroom and developed it with the care and precision of a man handling sacred relics. He prepared the chemicals, immersed the plate, and watched as the image began to emerge from the glass. But it was wrong. The photograph showed the window clearly, showed the frame and the glass, and even the faint reflection of Thomas himself standing behind the camera. But there was no face. The window in the photograph was empty. Whatever had appeared there, whatever Thomas had seen with his own eyes, had left no trace on the photographic plate. It was as if the dead man's face existed in some spectrum of reality that his camera could not capture, that the chemistry of silver salts and light could not record. Thomas stood in his darkroom, looking at the failed photograph, and felt something crack inside him. He was a man who had built his life around the belief that cameras could capture truth, that photographs were evidence, that what could be seen could be recorded. And now he was confronted with something that violated that fundamental principle. The face had been real enough for his eyes to see, but not real enough for his camera to capture. What did that mean? What category of existence did such a thing occupy? He emerged from the darkroom as the morning light was filling the kitchen, and he made a decision. He would go into town. He would find Dutch Morrison, and he would ask about the window, about the house, about what had happened here that might explain what he was witnessing. If he could not capture it with his camera, perhaps he could understand it through story, through history, through the testimony of those who had known this place longer than he had. He found Dutch at the Silver Dollar Saloon, an establishment that smelled of tobacco and spilled whiskey and the particular despair of men drinking before noon. Dutch was at a corner table with two other old miners, men with similar faces of weathered granite, playing cards with the desultory manner of those passing time rather than enjoying it. When Thomas approached, Dutch looked up, and Thomas saw recognition in his eyes, and something else, something like resignation. Thomas did not sit down. He stood beside the table and said simply that he needed to know about the window in the Hargrove House. He said he had seen something, and he needed to understand what it was. The other two miners exchanged glances and then stood up, gathering their cards, mumbling excuses, leaving Dutch alone at the table. Dutch sighed, a deep exhalation that seemed to come from somewhere beneath his lungs, and gestured for Thomas to sit. What Dutch told him, in a low voice that barely carried across the table, was a history that had been kept deliberately vague, spoken of in euphemisms and careful omissions. The Hargrove House, Dutch explained, had been built on land that had a peculiar reputation even before Josiah constructed his monument to silver wealth. The Ute people who had lived in these mountains before the miners arrived had avoided this particular spot, had marked it with stones arranged in patterns that the white settlers had dismantled without understanding. There was a spring nearby, now dried up, that the Utes had said was a thin place, a spot where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead grew permeable. Josiah Hargrove had either not known or not cared about such superstitions. He built his house, installed that peculiar window with its carved frame, and lived there prosperously for nearly 2 decades. But then people began to notice things. Josiah became withdrawn, stopped attending church, stopped participating in the social life of the town. He would be seen at odd hours, standing at his bedroom window, staring out at nothing, or perhaps at something only he could see. And then, 5 years ago, on a January morning, his housekeeper found him dead in his bed, frozen solid despite the fire burning in the stove, his eyes wide open, his face twisted in an expression that she later described as recognition, as if in his final moment he had seen something he knew. The house had remained empty after that. Dutch had inherited the responsibility of managing it as part of settling Josiah's estate. Several people had attempted to rent it, but none had stayed longer than a week. They all reported the same thing, though they described it in different ways. Something about the bedroom, something about the window, something about what could be seen there when the clock struck midnight. Dutch finished his story and looked at Thomas with eyes that had seen too much disappointment to hope for anything better. He asked Thomas if he wanted to leave, if he wanted his money back, if he wanted to pretend he had never asked. Thomas thought about this. He thought about his cameras and his commission and his belief that documentation was a form of truth-telling. And he said no. He said he would stay. He said he wanted to understand. Dutch shook his head slowly, the gesture of a man watching someone walk knowingly toward disaster, and told Thomas one more thing. Every person who had died in Leadville since Josiah Hargrove installed that window, Dutch said, eventually appeared in the glass. It might take days, might take weeks, but eventually, at midnight, they would be there, pressed against the window from the other side, their dead faces seeking something, offering something, trapped in some space between memory and oblivion. Thomas walked back to the Hargrove House through streets of frozen mud, past buildings that seemed to lean toward each other like tired mourners, under a sky the color of old iron. He had what he wanted now, a story, a history, a framework for understanding. But understanding did not bring comfort. If anything, it made the situation worse, because now he knew that what he was witnessing was not random, not isolated, but part of a pattern that had persisted for years, a pattern that would continue whether he documented it or not. That night, he prepared carefully. He set up all three of his cameras at different angles to the window. He laid out fresh plates, prepared multiple portions of flash powder, positioned lamps that he could light quickly if needed. He was methodical, scientific, treating this like any other photographic assignment, but his hands shook as he worked, and when he caught sight of his own reflection in the window, he saw a face already marked by lack of sleep, by fear, by the knowledge that some doors once opened cannot be closed. Midnight came, the light appeared, and the face that manifested in the window was a child's. She could not have been more than 7 or 8 years old. Her hair was blonde, arranged in braids, and she wore what appeared to be a nightgown. Her face had the peaceful appearance of someone who had died quietly, perhaps in sleep, with none of the violence or trauma that had marked the man from the previous night. But she was dead, unmistakably dead. Her skin that terrible gray white, her eyes open but seeing nothing, her small face pressed against the glass as if she were trying to look into a room she could not quite see. Thomas tried to photograph her. He triggered all three cameras, the flash powder igniting in a cascade of light that left purple after images dancing in his vision. And when the light faded and he looked at the window, the child was still there, still pressed against the glass, but now her mouth was opening and closing as if she were trying to speak, trying to communicate something urgent and important and impossible to hear through the barrier of the glass and death, and whatever space separated her world from his. He stood there, frozen by something more powerful than fear, something closer to grief, watching this dead child trying to speak. And he understood in that moment what Josiah Hargrove must have felt in the years before he froze to death in this room. This was not haunting in any conventional sense. This was not malevolence or vengeance or warning. This was something sadder and more terrible. This was the dead trying to reach back across the boundary they had crossed, trying to maintain some connection to the world they had left, trying to speak to those who could see but not hear, who could witness but not help. The child faded after a few minutes, the light dimming, her features dissolving back into darkness. Thomas stood at the window and wept, not from fear, but from a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical weight. He thought about developing the plates, about checking if this time the camera had captured what his eyes had seen, but he could not bring himself to do it. Not yet. Not while the image of that small dead face trying to speak was still so vivid in his mind. He did not sleep. He could not sleep. He sat in the chair wrapped in blankets and waited for dawn. And when the sun finally rose, he went downstairs and forced himself to eat something, though he had no appetite. And then he returned to his darkroom to develop the 3 plates from the night before. They were all blank. All 3 cameras had captured the window, the frame, the room, but the child's face was not there. Whatever existed in that window at midnight existed outside the reach of photographic chemistry, beyond the ability of light and silver to record. Thomas stood looking at the 3 failed images, and he felt his entire understanding of his craft, of evidence of truth, beginning to collapse. But he did not leave. Something kept him there. Some combination of stubbornness and curiosity, and perhaps a photographer's instinct that even if he could not capture this phenomenon with his camera, he still needed to witness it, to observe, to understand. He spent the day in a state of exhausted numbness, walking through Leadville without purpose, seeing the living people around him, and thinking about the dead faces in the window, wondering who would be next, wondering if there was a pattern to the order in which they appeared. That evening he prepared again, though this time he did not set up his cameras. There was no point. Whatever appeared in the window existed in some realm that photography could not reach. Instead, he simply positioned his chair to face the glass, wrapped himself in blankets against the cold that seemed to grow more intense each night, and waited for midnight. The face that appeared on the 4th night was familiar, though it took Thomas a moment to place it. It was one of the old miners he had photographed his first week in Leadville, a man with a magnificent white beard and eyes that had reflected decades of underground darkness. Thomas remembered him because the man had told him stories while he posed for the camera, tales of the deep mines, of cave-ins and gas pockets, and the particular terror of being trapped in darkness with the weight of mountains above. The man had been alive then, but the face in the window was dead, and Thomas realized with a cold shock that this death must have occurred recently, perhaps today, perhaps within the last few hours. The old miner's face showed no obvious trauma, just the unmistakable stillness of death, and his eyes, filmed over and sightless, seemed to be looking past Thomas at something beyond, something in whatever space he now occupied. His mouth opened and closed silently, and Thomas had the irrational urge to open the window, to somehow let him speak, to hear what message the dead were trying so desperately to convey. But he did not open the window. He sat in his chair and watched as the old miner's face remained pressed against the glass for several minutes, and then faded, the light dimming, the features dissolving, leaving only the ordinary darkness of a winter night in the mountains. The pattern continued. Each night at midnight, a different face. On the 5th night, it was a woman who looked to have died from disease, her face marked by the lesions of smallpox. On the 6th night, a young man whose neck bore the rope burns of a hanging. On the 7th night, a baby, its tiny face peaceful but unmistakably lifeless. Thomas witnessed them all. He stopped trying to photograph them. He stopped taking notes in his journal. He simply sat and watched, night after night, as Leadville's dead came to the window. He began to research the town's death records, spending his days at the newspaper office, reading through obituaries, matching faces to names, confirming what he already suspected. Every person who appeared in the window had died recently in Leadville, most within the previous few days. The window was not showing random dead, not pulling faces from history at large. It was showing the newly dead, those who had just crossed the boundary, those whose connection to the living world was still fresh enough to manifest in this peculiar way. Thomas found himself falling into a routine of horror. He would spend his days among the living, photographing them, documenting their world, and then at night he would return to the Hargrove House and witness them after they died. He began to feel like a curator of transition, someone who stood at the threshold between life and death, recording both sides of the crossing, even if his camera could only capture one half of that equation. The cold in the bedroom grew worse. Thomas burned through wood for the stove at an alarming rate, but no amount of fuel could warm the room. Ice formed on the inside of the walls. His breath hung visible in the air, even at midday. The cold was not natural. He understood that now. It was connected to the window, to whatever force or phenomenon caused the dead to appear there. The room was cold because it existed partially in their realm, the realm of the dead, where warmth and life had no place. On the 14th night, December 7th, something changed. The face that appeared at midnight was that of Dutch Morrison. Thomas stared in shock at the window, at Dutch's weathered features now marked by death, at eyes he had spoken to just hours before now filmed over and sightless. Dutch had been alive that afternoon. Thomas had seen him at the saloon, and now he was dead, and his face was in the window, pressed against the glass, mouth opening and closing with that terrible silent urgency that all the dead seemed to share. Thomas stood and approached the window, something he had not done since the first night. He stood close to the glass, close enough that his breath fogged it, close enough to see every detail of Dutch's dead face. And he saw something that he had not noticed in the other faces, something that had perhaps not been there before, or that he had not been able to perceive. In Dutch's filmed eyes, in the clouded pupils, there was an image, a reflection of something, or a vision, or a memory preserved in death. Thomas leaned closer, trying to see what was reflected in those dead eyes. And what he saw was himself, not his current self, not standing here at the window, but himself lying in a bed, lying very still, with his own face bearing the unmistakable marks of death. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering, his breath coming in short gasps. Dutch's face remained at the window for a few more seconds, and then faded as all the others had done, leaving Thomas alone in the freezing room with the knowledge of what he had just seen. He had witnessed his own death, reflected in a dead man's eyes, preserved in the window that showed the newly dead. Thomas did not sleep that night. He could not even sit. He paced the room, his mind racing, trying to understand what he had seen, trying to determine if it was prophecy or warning or simply observation. Was he seeing his future death, or was he seeing a possibility, something that could still be avoided? And if he left now, if he abandoned the house and returned to Boston, would that change what he had seen? Or was it already fixed, already inevitable? As dawn approached, Thomas made a decision. He would stay one more night, just one more. He needed to see if the pattern continued, if the faces kept coming, if there were answers hidden in this phenomenon that he had not yet understood. He told himself it was scientific curiosity, but he knew, in the honest part of his mind that remained uncorrupted by rationalization, that it was something else. He was addicted to the window. He was addicted to witnessing. He had become like Josiah Hargrove, unable to leave, compelled to watch night after night as the dead came to the glass. That day, December 8th, Thomas learned that Dutch Morrison had indeed died. Heart failure, they said at the saloon. He'd been alone in his room at the boarding house, had probably died in his sleep. They found him that morning when he did not come down for breakfast. Thomas listened to this news with the strange detachment of someone who already knew, someone who had witnessed the death before it was discovered, and he understood that he was now inhabiting some space outside normal time, some perspective that existed between past and future. He spent the day preparing his affairs. He wrote letters to his family in Boston, to his employers at the railroad, explaining that he needed to cut short his commission in Colorado for reasons of health. He packed his cameras and equipment. He arranged for everything to be shipped east. He was methodical, efficient, completing all the practical tasks of departure, but he did not actually leave. He told himself he would leave tomorrow, after one more night, after seeing what face appeared at midnight, after satisfying one more night of curiosity. But he knew he was lying to himself. He knew he would not leave. That night, the 15th night, December 8th, Thomas positioned himself in the chair as usual, wrapped in blankets against the cold that now seemed to emanate from his own bones as much as from the room. He watched the window as midnight approached, and he wondered whose face would appear, who had died in Leadville in the past 24 hours. Who would press their dead features against the glass and try to communicate something that could never quite be heard. Midnight came. The clock chimed. The light appeared, and the face in the window was his own. Thomas looked at himself, dead, his features bearing all the marks he had come to recognize over these 2 weeks. The grey-white pallor, the filmed eyes, the slack mouth. But there was something else, something visible in the way his own dead face was positioned in the angle of the neck. He had frozen to death, just as Josiah Hargrove had done. He could see it in the way his dead self's skin had taken on that particular crystalline quality, in the frost that clung to his eyebrows and hair. He was looking at his future. Or perhaps he was looking at his present, at what was happening to him even now, at a death that was occurring across time in a way that made past and future collapse into a single eternal moment. The cold in the room had grown so intense that he could no longer feel his fingers or toes. His breath came in shallow gasps. The blankets around him were stiff with ice. His dead face in the window tried to speak, mouth opening and closing with that familiar urgent silence. And Thomas, still alive but barely, understood finally what all the dead had been trying to say. They had been trying to warn. They had been trying to say, leave, escape, do not let this place claim you as it claimed us. But the warning came too late, always too late, because by the time you could see the dead in the window, you were already becoming one of them, already crossing the boundary, already lost. Thomas tried to stand, tried to move toward the door, tried to escape the room that had become his tomb, but his body would not obey. The cold had gone too deep. He was freezing from the inside out, his blood slowing, his heart struggling to pump through veins that were becoming ice. He slumped back in the chair, his eyes still fixed on the window, on his own dead face pressed against the glass. And he wondered with the last fragments of his consciousness if this was happening now or later, if he was dying or already dead, if time in this room flowed forward or backward or not at all. The face in the window, his face, began to fade as all the others had done. The light dimmed, the features dissolved. And as Thomas's vision darkened, as his heart gave its final struggling beats, he saw one last thing. In the eyes of his dead reflection, in the clouded pupils, there was an image, another face pressed against the glass, looking in at him. The face of whoever would come next, whoever would rent the Hargrove House, whoever would be drawn to the window and its terrible revelations. The cycle would continue. It always continued. The window would keep showing the dead night after night, at midnight, one face after another. An endless parade of those who had crossed the boundary, those who had left the world of warmth and breath and returned in this strange halfway state, pressed against the glass, trying desperately to communicate something that could never quite be heard. They found Thomas Brennan 3 days later. The landlord, concerned about the lack of activity at the house, had entered with a spare key and discovered the photographer frozen in the chair beside the window, his eyes open, his expression caught somewhere between terror and understanding. The room was so cold that the rescuer's breath hung in the air like fog, and ice covered everything. The walls, the floor, the elaborate carved frame of the window that showed nothing now but the ordinary mountains beyond. His body was returned to Boston for burial. His equipment was shipped to his family. His journal and photographs were examined but revealed nothing unusual, just the typical documentary work of a frontier photographer, images of mines and buildings and weathered faces. There was no record of the window, no documentation of what he had witnessed in those 2 weeks in December. The Hargrove House was locked up again. Dutch Morrison was dead, and no one else wanted the responsibility of managing a property with such a dark reputation. It stood empty through the winter, through the spring, through the following years, as Leadville continued its slow decline from boomtown to ghost town. The window remained, its carved frame weathering in the mountain air, its old glass reflecting the changing light, showing nothing unusual during the day. But at night, when the clock struck midnight, the light would still appear. And if anyone had been watching, if anyone had been foolish enough or curious enough to position themselves before that window in the darkness, they would have seen the faces. Different faces each night, all bearing the unmistakable marks of death, all pressed against the glass from the other side, all trying to speak, to warn, to communicate something that could never quite cross the boundary between their world and ours. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some windows were never meant to be looked through. Some deaths were never meant to be witnessed. But the Hargrove House stood as evidence that knowledge of these truths came too late to those who needed it most, came only after they had already committed to staying, to watching, to witnessing one face too many. The window waited, patient and terrible, for the next tenant, the next witness, the next soul who would think themselves immune to its pull, who would believe they could observe without participating, who would fail to understand until too late that in watching the dead they were watching their own future, their own fate, their own face pressed against the glass at midnight, trying to warn whoever came next. In the mountains of Colorado, where the air is thin and the cold goes deep, and the boundary between worlds grows permeable in certain places, the Hargrove House still stands, the window still waits, and at midnight, if you were there to see it, if you were foolish enough or curious enough or desperate enough to watch, you would see the faces come, one each night, different each time, all dead, all trying to speak. All trapped in that space between memory and oblivion, between the world they left and the world they cannot quite reach. The window shows what it has always shown. The window reveals what it has always revealed. And those who look long enough into that glass eventually see the one face that will make them understand, too late, what all the others were trying to say. They see themselves dead and frozen, pressed against the glass from the other side, their own warning that will go unheeded by whoever comes next. Whoever is drawn to that peculiar window in that cursed house on the edge of a dying town where the dead come at midnight to show their faces to the living, night after night forever, as long as there are deaths to witness and souls foolish enough to watch.